Hey everyone, Nick Ottinger here once again with Team Conti Sim Performance. This week it's going to be starting our season 4 of 2025, and we are at Lucas Oil Indianapolis Raceway Park, or in short, you can call it IRP. It's what a lot of drivers call it. So for Xfinity, this is a similar track that has attributes like New Hampshire. Running pretty much wide lanes you can have. You can have lines you can run, middle, and top. So this is a wide track. And we're going to dissect that clearly and look at some areas we can look to be competitive in and sometimes where we just have to compromise in. So I'm going to start this with just a 5 lap run, and then we can kind of dissect again like our normal processes of where some lines might be advantageous and the traits of what the car is doing and how we can keep it, active and what we need the balance to be. So let's just let this start for the first 5 laps and yeah, let it go. All right, that is 5 laps for us here at IRP. Put my webcam back on and kind of work with you guys on directions of what the line is, right? So we reference, similarities of what IRP and New Hampshire have. And it's obviously a short track. This is, 7/10 of a mile almost exactly. And you have some heavier braking zones to where it's going to, dive to the front and get into the splitter, possibly some contact, and then the bottom line, below the yellow line is really flat, and then you go up to that first lane. It is also pretty flat compared to when you get to the middle and top lines up here. So when we dissect this, I want to emphasize on how it is important to understand your minimum speed that you need to carry in and finding where that's going to be. Because once you have that minimum speed, our focus is going to turn towards realistically making sure you can start that momentum side of your lap. So let's just slow this down as normal. I'm going to start turning away from the wall here. And it's difficult to give you a mark, okay? It's difficult to give you an exact marker and guide other than put your eyes forward and look to where the seam is on the racetrack, okay? I would emphasize this line is the most key point to just have a neutral entry without having to use too much brake and wheel down into this area, because you can let it drift up into the center. You can let it drift up to the top line if you want to cross in these dash lines, or you can just stabilize the car and can keep it in, the middle of the track. But my objective here, and with our new UI that we have with iRacing in Season 4, let's look at our throttle here. You can see I'm starting to roll that back, and start decelerating, coming off the pedal, to ensure I'm not carrying too much entry speed, but also to make sure I'm not on the throttle and brake at the same time. I don't want to keep both down and really bind the car up and add more resistance to the front. Don't I want it to be capable. I want the front to be capable, and I want the rear just not to come up too quick and get too light. It's a short track. We've obviously been to many short tracks, but it's really key in making sure our balance is, consistent on entry. So let's reference this rolling phase, and you can see how I'm going to start straight lining my entry with some brake pressure as well. Once I get to that brake pressure, you can see I corrected the wheel to the right a little bit, right? So that is because of the rear is actually getting lighter. The more pressure I add, the more force I'm putting to the front, and the rear is actually popping up dynamically. So it's definitely creating a tilt, effectively like that. And our objective is not to add more brake pressure, just to add more brake pressure. That's why it's key to make sure you're pointing before you start turning into the corner, so you can actually have a consistent balance in neutralizing the car and keeping it neutral and keeping the front capable. So braking, let's continue to see how we're going to shape into our entry phase. We're keeping some consistent wheel and some decent brake, but the more I actually start driving into the center, further into the corner, I'm going to start releasing this brake. I was pretty much double this brake pressure to triple this brake pressure by the time I got to the seam. And this seam's very important because now I'm actually putting half the car on the flatter part of this track and putting the rates just on these dashed lines for a characteristic to just let me roll up to half a lane to make sure I'm keeping the lefts on this dashed line set. Okay, so let's go through the corner more. You can see how I'm going to start opening the wheel up a little bit because I'm getting off the brake. I'm in a rolling phase now. That rolling phase is key to make sure we're carrying that minimum speed and finding that point where our slowest speed in the corner is. In other words, our minimum speed is at anywhere through corner and process. That way we can shape the center how we need to and shape center the, getting off the corner how we need to, so we can keep consistency in the car. So let's look at this. You can see how I'm letting it drift up half a lane, now even a full lane. Now, this seam is a good tool to use, while we're cornering, to say, hey, I can definitely drive all the way up here, get up to the Lucas Oil Raceway Park, signage, and then start turning back down the hill. You can see I'm still in a rolling phase, and now I'm keeping the same radius of what this seam is, the dashed lines, and the lowest seam here. I'm keeping the same radius and capability. Now my mindset's shifted. At this point, I'm in that rolling phase still. You can see I have no brake, no gas, still in that rolling phase. Now my objective is to start creating that momentum at a certain point and making sure while I keep that momentum, the balance of the car is capable. So let's slow this up a little bit. You can see I get to my partial throttle and my minimum speed's 90. So once I get that, I'm going to start finding that point from partial throttle to work towards linear throttle to 100%. So this 50% linear throttle to 100%, I want to keep it smooth and linear. Just keep it going at a decent and smoother rate. So I'm going to turn down, add, just a little bit more throttle because the car is capable. You can see my speed's getting higher to the mid-exit of these corners. Once I get to these billboards, my objective is to keep the left front as close to the seam as possible without putting the left front just on this seam, because that flat, banking difference is we got 3 tires that are actually going to be using this banking essentially to keep turning the car, and the left front's going to go down to this flat that is now going to also help de-wedge the car, mainly making it turn at an abrupt notice. So that's why it's key not to always just cross this seam with so much throttle input and so much wheel input here. Okay, so let's slow it up to the mid-exit point, and then I'm keeping this partial throttle, and you can see I had to correct it a little bit to mid-exit, and now I made that adjustment driver-wise to start working towards my 100% moment confidently, because now the balance of the car, it feels comfortable. I got the grip and it's attainable. Okay, so gonna work all the way up to the wall, and short straightaway, obviously 7/10 of a mile racetrack, and turn 3 is going to be some of the same objectives. Just trying to point going into the corner, not add too much brake. Now turn 3 I think is an easier side of the track to get free in under braking, just because of the speed you're carrying, and realistically because it actually starts sharpening a little quicker than we anticipate. You know, we get down to this section, you see how sharp this curve is in radius. So our objective is to make sure we don't want to get too much brake down into this flat section down here. See, I'm putting the left front below that seam, trying to, get some actual grip. Rolling phase now, and just carry that rolling phase all the way to the center. See my minimum speed again. Same objectives I had in 1 and 2. It's actually going to be a little slower here, but my min speed, I'm fine in this zone. This Lucas Oil signage on the wall again is where my turn back down the hill, essentially back towards keeping the radius for exit is, and trying to drive with a linear process and get off the corner as straight as I can without getting the rear slipping. Okay, so that's just a regular, consistent line I would try. I've done a 20 lap run here, and I'll go later on to the run, but I'm gonna go back and just show a few laps in, chase perspective or exterior of the car, and so you can see what that looked like outside on the lap we just diagnosed. See how we're just letting it drift up, do a small diamond. Same objective in 3 and 4. Get the left front on the seam below it. Let it come up. See half the car at both ends here. Now, if we had capability and all the grip in the world, we would try holding the seam all the way into the center, where we might not let the car drift up to that diamond quality. But we don't have all the grip in the front, don't have all the grip in the rear. It's just the reality of this tire. So we got to make sure we're keeping that radius how we need, and sometimes we have to open that radius to make sure we're actually wrapping the second apex of the corner how it should be. So, all right, let's go to some other options. Let's go to about 17 and see what it looks like outside, and see if you notice a different line. See, I'm bringing the car down further, letting it still drift up about the same. See how it's a little bit more edgy, getting to a partial throttle. Now, see, it's going to carry that partial throttle, to full throttle, and yaw the car out. So that's why it's important when you're full throttle to make sure you're stable enough to keep throttle in the car. Gonna go slow here, about the same method I used before, and easier. Again, we reference how it's going to be easier getting loose in a 3. Just the reality I think 3 is, and I'm going to back this up here. This whole zone, once we get to the seam, I am on looser V2 here. So this week I'll have 4 options, and this is just a second iteration of looser to help keep the car cutting, center and that initial throttle stage, and these cooler track conditions we're going to have in nighttime racing, right? So that's the objective of what looser V2, looser is for. And in this zone, we might have some splitter contact on other options this week, and that might actually help mid-run, maybe later portion of the short run to mid-run, to where it keeps some turn and keeping this bottom line, but we have to take a little bit of entry speed away compared to looser V2. It's just something that might be a little trade-off this week. So you can see how I'm still trying to objectively put the left front below the seam, and you could even put the left front like this seam right here, this is the furthest you go down the track, okay? Maybe this is the shortest distance you cover. And you want to just wrap this seam. There's nothing wrong with that. If you feel the car is capable and you can wrap, some center speed and, center radius doing this, it's okay. This track is, again, it's wide. If you're trying to run this apron, I would recommend that's probably going to be a slaughter line. That is going to be hard to maintain drive off the corner and momentum off the corner because you're going to take so much center speed out. And again, going to take so much minimum speed out compared to keeping some momentum built up. So you can see how I'm just bringing the right sides, left sides right at that tipping point of the seam later on, 17, 18 laps to a run. So I'm gonna let this play for the next 2 laps as well, and so you guys maybe can see some alternatives of entry. And we just referenced that, right? Of how we want to maybe keep it above the seam at every single portion of the corner. That's what I did in 1 and 2 there. Felt pretty good. Didn't run through the bumps, and you can see how I'm doing the same thing here. I'm gonna stop it here because I had the same exact peak of the corner. You can see how my peak of distance I'm getting closest to the wall is before this zone now. And that's exactly the same distance I had away from the wall. I might just be 50 feet earlier, because I got the car capable and pointing earlier than I did if I was running below the seam maybe. So that's trade-offs of this track, trade-offs of a flat track and going into some banking, just like a New Hampshire. So let this play for one final, lap and close it out. Let's see how this is. Back to my normal process I would do. Keep it in this seam. Something that we did at Gateway, right? Keep it in between the seam and 1 and 2. For our center, the mid-exit. And then, yeah, just driving off the corner, letting it just grip and use all the grip and potential there. So, tough combination again to start our season 4. Short track, yes, and now we're going to start at least getting into some familiar tracks that everyone is accustomed to driving. And yeah, I think some final thoughts we can look at is don't overshoot entry. Make sure you can look and find your minimum speed, where you need that to be, and that is going to be in that range of those Lucas Oil signage and paint on the walls in the center of each corner. And making sure you're not overshooting and driving past that sign. Because if you're driving past that sign and you're still off the throttle and you're still waiting for the front to turn, 9 times out of 10, you're in a situation where you're just overspeeding your entry and you're delaying that process of where you need to start getting back to your throttle. So you may have the right mindset initially, but you're just delaying all those moments, and you need to maybe do it 150 feet sooner. So that's a common trait, short tracks a lot of drivers do, so that's something we just have to study as drivers and just do, look at. So, but that's going to do it for me this week. Appreciate you guys coming for season 4, and if you got any questions, please ask them. Always a DM away, and look forward to some success. So thank you, y'all.